So, loss of life preparation. This is a topic that I feel is necessary but often taboo. We as an American culture do not like to think about the end of our lives. We don't like to think about death. We often have it in the background somewhere. But I feel like it's very important to talk about the inevitability, right, that we all face. So, death is just part of life, right? And the better we are prepared for the loss of our loved ones, or the better we can prepare for our end, for those that we leave behind, then that makes the end of life, the grieving process and things like that. Um, I'm hesitant to say easier, but you won't have all this extra stuff you have to consider while you're in a very vulnerable grieving space. And so the more preparation we can do now, the better we are later on, okay? With that being said, I know that this is a topic that can be difficult for some people, and I definitely want to be aware of that, and I want to honor that. So if at any point during the presentation you feel that this might be a little bit more than you can handle, that is perfectly okay. All right, so you can either mute me, you can leave the call, come back to it later. Whatever you want to do is fine with me. I understand. And of course, if you have any need to talk with me afterward, I am available for care chats or just a phone call or a Zoom. If you feel like you need to have a conversation with me off camera by yourselves about this, I'm more than happy to be available for you in that, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. Oh, hold on. My wrong slide. Hold on. There we go. I'm going to give you the agenda for today. So we are going to talking about death, right? And some common experiences that caregivers have at the end of their caregiving journey. Many of you are taking care of someone who the end of their life means the end of your caregiving journey. And so there are some common experiences there that we can talk about. Then we're going to go over some very practical issues. We're going to talk about hospice and palliative care, late stage caregiving, funeral planning, and then of course, taking care of yourself. And then I'm going to give you a very brief after death checklist that may be helpful for some of you. And then we're going to talk about you and grief very briefly. Okay. So this will be a very information heavy presentation. There's going to be a lot of bullet points. And so I do encourage you to take notes or again, revisit that recording afterward because it is a lot of information to absorb. And I'm going to try to give it to you in a way that is not static or plain or boring or whatever, but you know, it is what it is, right? It's just information. And so there's not a lot of entertainment value to this one, which I think is appropriate considering the topic of conversation. So let's go ahead and get into it. Talking about death. So we all know that death is universal, right? Nobody can escape death or taxes, right? That's the saying, right? They're both inevitability, but it is unique to each person, right? Death has a different meaning for each person. And if you are caregiving for somebody who is diagnosed with a chronic illness, it's a very complex emotions in that space and very complex challenges that can come up. And so that's why I think having these conversations and having this information is very, very useful. Of course, in earlier times, death took place at home, right? With the family directly involved in caregiving and very few medical options to consider. But today, it occurs oftentimes in an institution or a care home or a hospital, right? And a lot of times your loved one is surrounded by, you know, hospital staff and medical equipment. Or they can be dying at home, right? Following a lot of trips to the ER and things like that. So there's a lot of medical sterilization around death now than there used to be in earlier times. It was more intimate and more personal back in the day, but now there's a lot of staff usually around and things like that, so it can become less intimate. But often as the illness or disability progresses, the amount of caregiving increases rapidly with little warning. Okay, so it can be good to have those staff members around you and things like that. But it can just kind of creep up on you pretty quickly. So we don't really know how that's going to look going forward. But with a little preparation, we can maybe take some of the mystery out of it, right? But of course, talking about death is difficult for most people. And it might be particularly uncomfortable to discuss with your family. But for most people, the older someone gets, the more comfortable the topic becomes, right? Mom lived a long, full life, she's at the end of her journey and things like that. But denial and avoiding honest acknowledgement of death, that can create really a lot of unnecessary pressure and do much really to harm close relationships and impact your caregiving. So speaking honestly about death, it does take courage, but it does bring many benefits, okay? So some common experiences of caregivers at the end of life. So healthcare and activities related to the end of life might be confusing and overwhelming, and that can create conflicting thoughts and emotions for you and other family members, okay? So here are some common experiences that you may anticipate going forward. That denial and feeling unprepared as the illness progresses, right? Sometimes we think, they are going to snap out of it, or they're going to heal, or they're going to be cured, right? And we all know that there are some diagnoses where that's just not an option, right? But we can still feel denial about that, and that's normal. Having chronic emotional fatigue, right? We often talk about caregiver burnout or compassion fatigue, where you're just kind of tired of caring. And so that's very, very normal, especially towards the end of life when your caregiving needs change, or your loved one's needs change, and maybe the work you're putting in increases, right? And so you are prone to that fatigue. Maybe you're feeling guilt, right? I think sometimes we get so used to feeling guilty, we don't even realize that it's happening, right? But you can feel guilt at the end of your loved one's life of, over a myriad of things, whether you feel like maybe it's your fault that they're dying, or maybe you feel guilty because maybe there's a little relief there that they're at the end of their lives, right? So there's a lot of complex emotions here, and that's normal. Maybe you're frustrated because you're not really understanding the course or prognosis of the illness, right? Maybe you haven't had the opportunity, or maybe you've been avoiding learning about those things. And so the end of life can be very frustrating for you because you're not really sure where the path is going, right? Where is it leading you? Maybe you're feeling angry. So that could be towards yourself, towards the person you're taking care of, or other caregivers in your space, or the lack of other caregivers, right? Sometimes family dynamics can get a little mucky in this space. You may grieve before the death, right? You may start grieving prior to your loved one dying, and that can be very complex, right? Some of you maybe have been grieving at the moment of the diagnoses, right? So maybe you've been grieving for years and you didn't even realize that that's what you were doing. Of course, sadness and grief, right? Maybe you're experiencing a lot of anxiety over unexpected and increasing financial burdens. Unfortunately, end-of-life care isn't free nor cheap. And so that, of course, can add and compound some of those stresses and anxiety you're already feeling. Maybe you're confused because there's a lot of really complex legal issues that come up after a loved one has passed, or even before they've passed, and that can be really overwhelming, especially if you're already coming from a space of overwhelm. Then to add more stuff on top of it can just really feel like you're drowning in that space. So of course, with this training, it's not going to include everything that you need to know, but I'm hoping it'll give you a good baseline to start to kind of get rid of some of that confusion. And then, of course, you could just be feeling a lot of stress in your relationships or your immediate family, right? Even though we know death is inevitability, we know it's coming for everybody, it's still very stressful when you're facing it up close, right? So these are all very, very normal feelings. You may feel all of these, you may feel none of these, and that's okay. Everybody's different, everyone's unique, but these are just some common things that people experience. And although we know that someday our loved one will pass, we do tend to ignore that possibility. As we face that reality, our loved one is dying, our priorities might shift, right? Life details can fade to the background. We might find ourselves looking at deeper meanings, right? So we can have these really introspective type of moments, right? Where we kind of look back and at the whole picture and try to determine how do we feel about that now, right? Maybe there's some past conflicts that are in your life that maybe aren't seeming as important to you now, right? Maybe you're having a desire to resolve difficulties in your relationship, and that's going to be a priority for you, okay? So just be mindful of that. So grief does start before your loved one actually passes. That is common. And impending death often presents an opportunity to evaluate your life as well, right? People will often contemplate their accomplishments and acknowledge their shortcomings and regrets. Okay, so if your loved one is capable to have these conversations with you, don't be surprised if they pop up. Okay, if they start to kind of look back at their life and then what it meant to them and things like that, and that happens to a lot of us, right? So that's normal. So some practical issues, okay? So there are a number of practical issues that should be discussed prior to death. So of course, if you're caring for a loved one who cognitively cannot have these conversations, that's okay, right? But if you have someone who you can have these conversations with, I encourage you to do that. Even if they're difficult, they are necessary, okay? So some things that you can discuss with your loved one. What clothes and accessories do they want to wear to the funeral or the cremation or whatever ceremony you have for them? Okay. Where are the official papers like the will, medical power of attorney, telephone numbers and email addresses of people that are near and dear to you and to your loved one? Information about funeral or memorial service wishes, right? Plans for disposition of that lifelong collection of knickknacks and things like that, right? Where should we put all the things now that they're no longer being loved and cherished by their owner anymore? Is there a safe deposit box? Where's that key, right? What happens if your loved one or what does your loved one want in terms of like medical intervention, right? A lot of people do have power of attorney, or they do have like a do not resuscitate order, or maybe they have one that's like, do whatever you can to keep me going as long as, I possibly can. Just know what those wishes are and know how to go ahead and enact those wishes, okay? Are there any major outstanding bills or payments due in the next few months, right? Anybody who might be expecting some money, you need to let them know that a death has occurred, or you need to know how to take care of those bills yourself. There could be things like estimated income taxes that you have to take care of that can be kind of nasty to navigate. So just kind of thinking about that now rather than later can really save you a lot of heartache and a lot of headache. Because of course, if you're in a space where you're grieving, you've lost somebody that you really care about. The last thing you want to worry about is, the phone bill that's due, right? So doing that legwork now can allow you that space to really process and grieve when you need to, okay? Would your loved one like to, donate their body to science? Are they organ donors? If they are, you need to know that because that's a very time-sensitive thing. And so you need to know what that looks like after they pass and how quickly you need to get that done. So that way you're not scrambling or worst case scenario, you can't fulfill your loved one's wishes because you waited too long. Okay, so that's just something to start thinking about. So I'm just going to read this slide real quick. If your loved one doesn't already have a will, encourage them to complete one if they can. And I would also say if you are taking care of a child, adult child, or whomever that more than likely will outlive you, make sure you have these things in order, okay, so that they don't have to stress out about it, or whoever's taking over their care don't have to stress out about it, okay? So if you don't have a will, I encourage you to get one done as well. Know the location of bank, money market, mutual fund accounts, pensions, insurance policies, retirement accounts. Okay, know where all that paperwork is. Know who you need to contact, okay, when the end of life does come. Discuss important information about family history, right? So where's some really important photographs or heirlooms, irreplaceable items, right? Where are those? What can you, and how can you preserve those? Okay, so they don't accidentally get tossed out with the houses being, put on the market and sold. You want to make sure you have all those irreplaceable items safe and secure so that way they don't get lost in the shuffle. And if possible, if your loved one is able to do so, have them complete an advanced directive, okay? So what is an advanced directive? So that's going to be a living will or healthcare directive. And so that's just going to allow the person to state in advance their wishes regarding treatments like the do not resuscitate or things like that that may prolong their life or not, okay? And then of course the healthcare power of attorney or the advanced directive durable power of attorney, healthcare and living wills. Those are official documents where your loved one can write down their wishes for their healthcare and can help guide you make decisions for them, okay? I do know that if someone is passing from a dementia-related disease or a disease that causes dementia, There's very little that they can do towards the end stages to resuscitate or save their lives, because as the brain deteriorates, the functioning shut down. And so, if your brain cannot tell your body to metabolize food, you're not going to be able to eat and digest. Okay, so a feeding tube would not be appropriate in that space. Or if your brain no longer can tell your body to metabolize medication, right? Then the medication isn't going to help. Okay, so just having a realistic idea of what that looks like and what they can and can't do, it might lessen the sting a little bit of a do not resuscitate, and maybe alleviate some guilt that you may feel, or maybe some of the powerless you may feel. Okay, because at the end there may just not be anything that they could do, and so it would just be prolonging the inevitable, right? So you can, of course, Google this information and figure this out on your own. But if you do need some professional guidance, you can find an elder attorney law, and they specialize in probate law. And so you can go to the National Elder Law. Oh, sorry, they do go to the National Elder Law Attorney Academy. Sorry, I was reading my notes wrong. And you can contact your local area agency on aging, and they can help you find a qualified attorney if you need to. Okay, so some people are going to have more complex end-of-life legal issues than others, and so this may not be applicable to everybody. But if you do have things like, estates and, insurance and, living, wills and all those things that are more complex, and you just would like to have somebody outside help you, there's ways to navigate that system and find somebody that can. Okay. So we're going to switch gears. We're going to talk about hospice and palliative care. So oftentimes when you say the word hospice, people kind of bristle to that, right? We often think of hospice as, end of life care, and it can be very daunting to think about bringing somebody in that space. But I think if we talk a little bit about what that is, what the expanse of services are, you may be more inclined to take advantage of their services. And on that note, I do have a training coming down the pipeline this month for Expect Care, which is a local hospice in Alabama. And Lance is going to come on and to kind of talk about palliative care, hospice care. And I think it'd be a really good training for y'all to hop onto. So just pin that in your brain, okay, for next time. So very few people know about hospice or palliative care or take advantage of what it can offer to dying patients as well as their loved ones. Okay, so there's a lot that you can do with hospice that kind of helps this transition become a little bit more smooth. So palliative care is also called comfort care. And the primary means for that is to provide relief to a terminally ill person by managing symptoms and pain. Okay. The goal for palliative care is not to cure your loved one, but to provide comfort and maintain the highest quality of life that's possible for as long as life remains. Okay. Well-rounded palliative care programs will also address mental health and spiritual needs. And so that's not just for your loved one, that's for you as well. Okay. So they take on the whole system as a client. Okay. So the focus is not on death, but on compassionate, specialized care for the living. Okay. Palliative care will provide support for the whole person and those who are sharing in that person's journey of love, right? So that's you, that's, grandkids, kids, friends, church members, right? Whomever that is in that space. And palliative care can be delivered in hospice or in a home setting or even in hospitals, okay? So they can come to you. And hospice is a model of care that was developed to provide palliative care for the dying. It created a standard for that good palliative care through its recognition that the needs of the dying are different than those who expect to recover, right? So hospice will acknowledge that caring for those who love and take care of their patient is part of caring for the patient, okay? So you can use these services and know that you're not going to be left in the wind, okay? They're there for you as well, okay? And that can be really, really supportive. And I know, of course, I don't know about all the hospice programs and things out there available to you, but I do know some will have social workers on staff, they'll have chaplains on staff, they have a team of people that can address the multiple layers of need in the end of life. Okay, so it's not just about giving mom painkillers until she passes. Okay, that could be part of it, but there's more to it than that. Okay, so I encourage you to reach out and see what's available to you. Sometimes your insurance will even cover hospice care, so it could really be a boon to your mental health and your capacity to sustain this last leg of your journey. Okay, so I encourage you to look into that. So when is it time for that late stage and end of life care? Okay, there's really no specific way to say what's this time or that time, right? Um, it's very much depends on the individual and the progression of their illness. Okay, so if we think of like Alzheimer's disease or dementia, your loved one's doctor is likely going to provide you with information on the stages of that diagnosis, and they can provide general guidelines for understanding the progression of symptoms and planning for appropriate care. But for other life-limiting illnesses, here's some following signs that you may want to talk to your loved one about hospice or palliative care rather than curative care. Okay, so these are just some signs to look out for. Your loved one has made multiple trips to the emergency room and their condition has been stabilized, but the illness continues to progress significantly. Okay, and that's going to affect their quality of life. Maybe they've been admitted to the hospital several times within the last year with the same or worsening symptoms, right? They try to treat it and, maybe they can get them, wrapped up and sent home, but then the problems persist or they get worse. Okay, they're not healing anymore. Maybe your loved one is wishing to remain at home and not spend time in the hospital, right? They're like, I'm not going back there. They didn't do anything for me last time. I'd rather stay home. Okay, and that's okay. Or they've decided to stop receiving treatments for their disease, right? They're still cognitively able to make those wishes clear and they say, I'm done, this is good enough. I'm just gonna enjoy the time I have left, okay? That would be a good indicator that you need to call, if you choose to, palliative or hospice care professionals, okay? So what about your needs, okay? As your loved one enters that late stage or end of life care, their needs are going to change, right? And that's going to impact the demands that you face as their caregiver, right? So here's some areas that can manifest, okay? Practical care and assistance. So maybe your loved one can no longer talk or sit or walk or eat or even make sense of the world, okay? Routine activities like bathing, feeding, dressing, or even turning that might require complete support from you. They can no longer even assist in that anymore, okay? Of course, that's going to increase the need for physical strength on your part, right? So that's going to be very challenging for some of you. You can, of course, find support for these tasks through personal care assistants like a hospice team, or if the physician orders a nursing service to come to your home, okay, so you don't have to do it by yourself. Next, comfort and dignity. So even if your loved one's cognitive and memory functions are depleted, they can still feel frightened. They can still feel at peace, right? They have the capacity to feel sad or secure. That still remains. So regardless of where they're being cared for, whether that's a home or hospital or a hospice facility, the most helpful interventions are those that are going to ease pain and discomfort and provide them that chance to experience meaningful connections to family and loved ones at the end, okay? So respite care can give you and your family a break from that intensity of that end of life caregiving, okay? Because those needs will increase as your loved one declines, right? And we all know that. And we often will maybe feel guilty for taking a time away, from stepping away. If we know our loved ones has little time left. But respite care, the importance of that does not end just because your loved one is dying. Okay, if anything, I feel like you probably need it even more, right? You need to have that, you need to come up for air every once in a while, right? So you can just have somebody sit with your loved one for a couple hours while you go and get coffee or lunch with a friend, right? Hospice care, or if you have a caregiver or a respite provider already that you use, they can maybe come in for a couple hours. Maybe you have your loved one have a brief inpatient stay at a hospice facility, right? Maybe they go away for the weekend and then they come back home, okay? Whatever that looks like for you. We just don't want to omit respite towards the end, okay? It's still very necessary for you. And then of course, grief support. So anticipating your loved one's death, that can produce a lot of feelings from deep sadness or even just feeling numb, right? So if you have access to a grief counselor or a bereavement specialist or spiritual advisors, right? Maybe you have rabbi or a pastor or a priestess or whomever you see that can come in and offer that support for you. That'd be a good time to involve them, okay? And that can kind of help you navigate this as best as possible, okay? So don't do it alone, I guess, is the bottom line, right? So what does caregiving look like in the final stages of life? So of course the symptoms vary from person to person and diagnoses to diagnoses, right? But there are some common experiences or common symptoms that we experience towards the end of life. And it's important to remember that experiencing any of them doesn't necessarily indicate that your loved one's condition is deteriorating or that death is close. But just keep in mind, the history, the diagnoses. And so these are just some signs to look out for, okay? So some symptoms, drowsiness, okay? Your loved one could be having a really hard time staying awake. And so it's important to, if you are gonna plan visits or any activities, try to see when your loved one is the most alert so that you can actually have impactful moments while they're awake. And of course, if they're resting, just let them rest. Maybe your loved one starts to become unresponsive. So, but your loved one is still probably going to be able to hear, even if they're no longer able to speak. Okay. So talk to them as if they can hear you, because they can. Okay. Even if they're not responsive, they can still hear your words of, love or forgiveness or whatever it is that you're going to share with them. They could probably still hear that. Okay. Maybe they're feeling confused about time and place or even identity of their loved ones. So we can speak calmly to them to help them reorient. We can gently remind them of the time and the date and people who are with them. Of course, we don't want to be angry with them because they don't remember these things. They can't help it, okay? Loss of appetite or a decreased need for food and fluids. So let them choose if they want to eat or drink, right? Because I remember I told you before, sometimes the systems are shutting down and they just can't process food and drink anymore, right? Their digestive system isn't working anymore. And so trying to force feed them, do feeding tubes and things like that, that's not really going to help them at all and probably just cause them more pain and stress than you're intending. So let them choose. Ice chips, water, juice, that can be really refreshing for your loved one if they can swallow, of course. Maybe you just want to put, like chapstick or lip balm or something on their mouth to keep them comfortable so they don't have those cracked lips and things like that. So I really want to drive home that it's really about comfort, right? And it's not about curing, okay? So it's okay if they're not eating anymore. Their body's telling them they don't need to, okay? They may have loss of bladder or bowel control, right? Some of you are already experiencing that now, but it may intensify towards the end, okay? So we just want to keep them clean and dry and comfortable as best as we can. We can use those disposable pads in the bed and remove them when they get soiled, right? Just some of you are already doing that today. So it's just kind of the part of the course, right? Their skin may become cool to the touch. And so you can warm them up with, blankets from the dryer or something like that. But we definitely don't want to use electric blankets or heating pads because that can cause burns, especially if they're not able to communicate that it's too hot or that they're being burned. We might not even know that that's what's happening until, it's too late. So just avoid those if you can. And maybe your loved one will start to breathe more laboriously or irregular or shallow, right? Or even noisy breathing. It might be easier for them to breathe if they're turned onto the side or if they've got pillows placed beneath their head or around their back, right? It might help a little bit for them. Or you can even use like a cool mist humidifier to kind of make the air easier to breathe in. Again, this is really just about comfort, right? It's about how can we make them feel comfortable towards the end, okay? And emotional comfort, right? We need to provide that for them. And we also need to have a source for that for ourselves as well, right? Because this can be really hard. Even if we know it's going to come, right? We know it's happening, it still can be very difficult, okay? So just like physical symptoms, we have to address our emotional needs as well, right? And these are going to vary from person to person. But there are some emotions that are common during the end of life and end of life care. Many will worry about loss of control of their and loss of dignity as their physical abilities decline. And I feel like this is where hospice really shines, right? If your loved one is feeling fear that they're burdening a loved one, or fear being abandoned, right? Having a team to come in and help can really give your loved one peace of mind to know that you're not doing it all by yourself, right? And that you have somebody to comfort you. They can definitely feel peace with that, okay? But then also that loss of dignity, right? Hospice can come in and help maintain that dignity as long as possible, okay? So as a late stage caregiver, you can offer emotional comfort to your loved one in several different ways, okay? Keep them company, right? Talk to them, read to them, watch movies together, or you can just sit and hold their hand, right? Because they've never died before. It could be scary to them, right? And so having you there to comfort them can really help them, right, as they transition. We don't want to, burden our loved ones with our feelings of fear or sadness or loss, right? This is where you talk to somebody else, right? So again, hospice, they can bring in a social worker, they can bring in, a chaplain or something, right? Right? Someone that you can talk to help process through, because we don't want to. Of course, we want to say the things that have been left unsaid, right? We want to have those conversations with our loved one. But if we're feeling afraid and we're feeling, anger or what have you, let those conversations be for somebody else, right? Not with you and your loved one. But you can allow your loved one to experience their fear of death, right? If they have it. It can be difficult to hear someone talk about that if you love them, talk about leaving family and friends behind. But if you let them communicate their fears, that can help them come to terms with what's happening, right? Just think about, if it were you, right? What would you want to have happen, and how would you like to have those conversations, right? And we just try to listen without interrupting or arguing, okay? The time for us to process hard things is going to come after, okay? Allow your loved one to reminisce, right? Talking about their life and their past, that's another way for them to gain perspective on their life and process that dying, right? If they're able to, right? Of course, not everybody's going to be able to, but if they can, let them have this conversation. We want to avoid withholding difficult information. So if they're still able to comprehend, most people will prefer to be included in discussions about issues that concern them, right? So we don't want to talk about somebody while they're in the room as if they're not there, right? As if they're not part of the process and can participate in the decision making, right? This is their death, and we want it to be a good death, right? Honor their wishes. So reassure them that you're going to honor their wishes, like advanced directives and living wills, even if you don't agree with them. Okay, so there's some things that your loved one wants to do that you don't think they should do these things, but that is not your choice. Okay, they get to decide how that goes. Okay, and then of course respect their need for privacy. Okay, end of life care for many people is often a battle to preserve their dignity and end their life as comfortably as possible. Okay, so for those of you who have children, you know that before the baby came, you had a birth plan, or you prepared for that, right? You had baby showers and all those things. The same is true at the end, right? As it is in the beginning. We have plans, we have wishes, we have desires, we have ways that we want it to go. And it's our job as caregivers and as loved ones to make sure that their plan can happen and come to life as best as it can, okay? So next we're going to talk about funeral planning. This is probably one of the more daunting tasks, right? But it is a very important part in preparing for death, okay? The last thing you want to do when your loved one dies is scramble to get all this stuff in place, okay? Sometimes it's unavoidable, right? Death occurs unexpectedly all the time. But if you have time to prepare for it, I encourage you to do so, if nothing else, but just for your future self, right? To give them a little bit of a relief from all this extra stuff while you're trying to grieve, okay? So funeral costs, on average, will range from $8,000 to $12,000 or more. Okay, wooden or metal caskets featured in funeral homes can cost $2,000 or more. flowers, obituary notices, acknowledgement cards, burial liners, vaults, special transportation, right? That can add a couple $1,000s even more, right? But funeral homes have rules that require them to provide prices and lists of available options to you. So general services, caskets, or other burial containers. And funeral homes have to disclose these prices to you either by telephone or have a list for you to review at each facility. And it's recommended that you call or visit at least 3 funeral homes and cemeteries to compare prices, okay? With 3 lists, you can more accurately assess the total costs and be able to compare, okay? But I do want to remind you all that you don't need a costly funeral to show love or respect for your loved one, okay? Unfortunately, there are people in the funeral home business who, they don't see you necessarily as a grieving client. They see you as their bottom line, right? And so they can take advantage of you in a vulnerable state and maybe even like guilt you into spending more than you can afford, right? Because you want to honor your loved one on all these things like that, right? You can honor your loved one on a budget, okay? And I know for me, as I plan my end of life for my children, I don't want them to be burdened financially because they have some, big grand display at my funeral. Okay. That's not what I want. And I'm sure your loved one feels the same, right? Or at least similar to that, right? They don't want to have you go into debt if you can avoid it for their funeral. Okay. So having these things planned ahead of time can help minimize guilt-fueled purchases, right? Or grief-fueled purchases, okay? So having this planned before can actually be more cost-effective for you and your loved one, okay? But just make arrangements that are best for you and your family, okay? No one needs to be buried in a golden casket, okay? Okay, and then we're gonna talk about taking care of yourself, right? It may seem impossible to take care of yourself during your loved one's final stages, but it is critically important that we do so to avoid burnout because you can be burnt out at the very, very end, right? It's very stressful. And research suggests that if you're a spouse taking care of a loved one, you're most likely to experience despair rather than any fulfillment in your caregiving role. Now, that does come afterward, right? But the research says that when your loved one dies, and your caregiving journey ends, you are more likely to feel despair over anything else, okay? So taking care of yourself in this space is going to be very crucial as you heal, okay? But whatever your circumstances are, it's important to seek that support that you need so that you can adjust, gain acceptance, and eventually move on, okay? So bereavement support groups, spiritual advisors if you have those, hospice teams if you have those, okay? Take care of yourself with the support of others if you can, okay? So after your loved one has passed away, some family members and caregivers draw comfort from taking some time to say their last goodbyes, to talk or pray before proceeding with final arrangements. So give yourself that time if you need it, okay? Sometimes people cope by being busy, and I understand that, okay? And that's not wrong. But at some point, you're going to have to stop and be still, okay? At some point, the dust is going to settle and you're going to be with yourself and your feelings, okay? So whenever that time comes, let it come, okay? And make sure you have support when it does, all right? So now we can get into some more practical steps that we can take after your loved one has passed, okay? The death of a loved one is very difficult to experience. There are a lot of emotional readjustments that you need to make. And you may be called to make a lot of important decisions, okay? So this is a great framework for you to get started, to know what you need to have done. And you can even have this list to hand over to somebody who maybe is more capable to help you with this, okay? But it's good to know what's coming down the pipeline so that you can prepare for it, okay? So here's a list of basic actions that you'll need to take after the death of your loved one. Okay, so some of these might not apply to you, all of them may, okay? So you're gonna have to contact the coroner or the justice of the peace through the local police after they've passed, if they've passed at home. so that they can pronounce the death. Okay, so if your loved one is passing in a hospital, they will probably already have somebody come in and do this for you. But if they are passing at home, you're going to have to contact your local police department and have them call a coroner. Okay. Now, you don't necessarily have to call 911. Okay, you can call the non-emergency line and they'll send somebody out. Okay, contact the funeral home. Right, you've already made the arrangements. They know it's coming. Just let them know it's happened. Okay. Your spiritual advisors, ministers, priests, rabbis, priestess, okay, these things, they can come in and offer you, if your loved one wanted last rites or you just need that support, they are there to pray with you or do whatever ritual makes you feel comforted, okay? And the insurance agents, okay, so life insurance, car insurance, like any of those people, you need to let them know that someone has passed, okay? If applicable, your attorney, right? Maybe you have an elder law attorney, or maybe you have an estate attorney, right? Somebody to come in and do all that legal stuff. Let them know that a death has occurred, okay? An accountant, an executor of the state, that could be you, it could be somebody else. Government offices, so that's like Social Security, IRS, the VA, okay? If you're receiving any of those benefits or if there's any taxes due or what have you, let them know a death has passed and then they'll guide you in the next steps. If your loved one had a pension, right, call the plan administrators, banks, investment companies, mortgage companies, right? Anybody who's expecting a payment, let them know that a death has passed. Now, you probably don't have to do that the day of, right? These will probably be in the days to follow. But these are just people you need to have on the queue, right, to get in contact with them. You may have to contact an attorney to ask about changing title on real estate property. If applicable, application for a widowed person exemption as well as homestead and disability exemptions may be completed. You might not have to do all those things, but if you do, they can be very complicated and very frustrating. And so if you have somebody assist you in that, that could probably make things a lot easier for you. All right, collecting necessary papers, right? So before you can file for various benefits and take care of other financial matters, you'll have to collect a variety of documents, whatever those are, okay? Contact insurance companies. So in addition to life insurance, check and see if there's other forms of insurance covered by the deceased. Some loans, mortgages, and credit card accounts are covered by credit life insurance, and that can pay off account balances. So you want to contact each insurance company about how to claim those policy benefits if they're in place, okay? And if they're not in place now, I would encourage you to inquire about getting those in place, right, to make things easier for you. If you can't find their policies among their papers, check their checkbook or paycheck stubs for any premiums paid. So this generally, life insurance will be paid directly to the named beneficiary. And most companies will offer to pay the benefits in a lump sum or a fixed payment over time. Okay, so just contacting them and having them guide you through that. Notify Social Security. So you need to let the Social Security Administration know if the deceased was already receiving Social Security. You need to let them know that they've passed. You may be able to apply for survivor's benefits. And so you're going to need that birth certificate, death certificate, and marriage certificates, Social Security numbers, and a copy of their most recent federal income tax return. Okay, so these are things that you can get together now. Of course, you can't get the death certificate now, but you can get the other documents together now, have them in a safe place. So that way, when you do make these calls, you're not searching through a garage full of bins and baskets, right? Trying to figure out where the stuff is. And then claiming those benefits. So veterans benefits, Social Security, employee benefits, those may be available. Some unions or other professional organizations can provide benefits as well. So just be aware of what those are prior to, if you can. And then begin probate. So probate is the court supervised process of paying off the debts of the deceased, okay, and distributing the estate to any beneficiaries. Jointly owned property, property and trust, assets with a designated beneficiary like 401k, life insurance, pensions, those do not go through the probate process, okay? So it's just about their debts, okay? Let's see. And if your loved one did not have a will, the state law is going to determine how their assets are distributed and their property is distributed among family members. So the court will appoint a personal representative, or the person named in the will as the executor will manage their affairs. Okay, so contact probate court in the state where your loved one lived for details. So that would be Alabama, okay? Let's see. So it sounds like a lot. That's why I think it's good to get a head start, okay? So let's again talk about you and grief, okay? So just like our body requires time to heal from physical injury, our emotional life also needs time to recover from the loss, okay? But you probably already know that, okay? Grief is the natural process that follows upon death, right? Grief is just another expression of love, okay? It's just love transformed. And though everyone's different, there are some common experiences of grief, okay? So I'm just going to go through these very quickly. So grief can look like you are reacting emotionally, but within character to loss. So sadness, despair, depression, okay? That's normal and it's expected, okay? You review the relationship with your loved one. What did they mean to you? What did they do for you? And how will you manage without them? Okay, that's common. Maybe you're having emotional outbursts at how unfair it is, right? So this is displacing anger onto others. So that could be the person who's passing, right? That could be the hospice staff, right? Anybody in eyesight, right? Just displacing that anger. And we all know anger shows up to protect us from harder feelings. And so if you do feel angry in your grief process, that's normal and expected, okay? Maybe you're going to start seeking replacement figures. So searching for people who take over or fill in for your loved one. Okay. Maybe not everybody, but I know that does happen sometimes where the grief is too hard to face. And so they almost get like a surrogate person to kind of distract them from that grief. Okay. That's normal and it happens. You may revisit your current relationships or revise your current relationships. So, you know, you've been married for decades and now you're single, right? And you're in a community full of couples, okay? That can be kind of jarring and you're trying to find out where you are in that space, okay? But eventually, excuse me, revising and reshaping your personal identity, that can happen after a loved one passes because you're changed by that death, right? And it can take a while for you to decide who you've become, okay? So you're not who you were at the beginning of your caregiving journey, and death changes you, and you have to kind of figure out, you know, who am I now that I'm not a caregiver? Who am I now that I'm not a spouse? Who am I now that, you know, maybe my child has passed, right? And so having that time to really kind of ground yourself in who you are and find out who that is. That's part of the grieving process as well, okay? And eventually, most people will re-enter the community, fully participating and all that, but it does take time, okay? And there's no timeline for grief. Of course, you know, they say if you are feeling at the 6-month mark the same as you did as day one, that's, you know, an issue that a mental health provider can help you through. But most people will recover on their own, okay, after some time, okay? And I honestly feel like grief never goes away, it just changes, right? Some days it's waves, other days it's trickles, but it never really goes away. We just learn to live with it, right? And that's okay. Right. So here are my sources. It's not many, but if you're interested in going in and doing a deeper dive or even just getting some of these bullet points, you're welcome to, of course, use these sources. I do post this online as well, but if you are interested in my slides, I'm okay with sharing this with you just so you have that to go back to reference, because again, it was a lot of information. And it was a lot of hard information. And I'm sure as I was going through it, you probably had, you know, your rabbit trails of thoughts, and then you came back and, oh, I missed something. And that's okay. The information is available if you need it. And of course, if you want to reach out to me for any reason to get this information, or if you have questions, I will answer them as best as I can. I'm not an elder law attorney. I'm not part of a probate court or anything like that, but I can definitely help you navigate the information I presented to you today if you need that extra help, okay?